Justin Jefferson's out, Ja'Marr Chase is quite literally always open, and we've got breaking headlines to cover. Let's cut right to it. Here are your Week 6 wide receiver rankings. I mean, what a turn of events for Ja'Marr Chase, right? From working with a hurt QB and falling out of the top few spots in these rankings to being the guy. I'll tell you why this is justified. Chase has been classified as open more than anybody else. After talking the talk, he has walked the walk. His 15 catches for 192 yards and 3 touchdowns was historic, legendary, and enough to put him at the number 1 spot here. But that's not the only reason. Chase is third in the league among qualified receivers in overall target share, and his first read share is at 41.7% when he faces zone coverage. His opponent this week, the Seahawks, play zone 86% of the time, more often than anybody else in the league. This is a match made in heaven. Seattle also allows the most fantasy points to wide receivers. Tyreek Hill is the current wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy PPR, and it's because of his big play upside. Hill is 4th in deep targets and 3rd in air yard share at over 46%. This comes from a lack of volume and availability with Jalen Waddle, who we'll talk about later, considering he has been injured. Hill is the lead receiver on the only offense averaging over 500 yards per game at the moment. Hill has at least 9 targets in 4 of the first 5 games at the moment, but his opposition is a little more strict on paper. The Panthers only give up 185 passing yards per contest, but remember they are 0-5. Teams playing them aren't really feeling too inclined to pass the ball in the second half. I didn't think this was possible, but Stephon Diggs continues to get better and better. After having just 6 games with 11 or more targets for all of last season, Diggs has already hit that mark 3 times in 2023. He has 4 100-yard games so far, although he caught a bit of a break getting wide open for a 48-yard touchdown against the Jags last week. Diggs does have a nice matchup this week against the Giants. This Bills team is favored by a pair of touchdowns, so be careful in terms of understanding that he needs to get involved early to be effective. He will face off against Adoree Jackson and Deonte Banks, both defensive backs allowing a passer rating of well over 100. Roll with Diggs easily here. The lead up to Week 6 has made this literally the perfect storm for a CeeDee Lamb breakout game. We've got him at number 4 overall. He showed dissatisfaction about a lack of looks last week. The Cowboys got stomped by the 49ers and went home frustrated. And then Richard Sherman grabbed the mic, went on national television, and called Lamb overrated and not within the top tier of wide receivers. I have a hypothesis that Richard Sherman might have been betting CeeDee Lamb overs this week because not only should that set him off, the Cowboys are playing against arguably the worst secondary in the NFL right now. The Los Angeles Chargers allow 300 passing yards per game on the nose, the highest mark in the league. This has the makings to be a monster game for Lamb. Sit back and enjoy. Cooper Kupp is back and wasted no time getting involved as an integral part of this Rams offense. The man had 5 catches on 6 targets on the first drive of his comeback game. Kupp had a 32.4% target share against the Eagles. I will say this team was working from behind against Philly, so they did have to go more pass heavy. But in general, they have hung around the top 10 all year in pass frequency, and that was without one of the best wide receivers in the league. He squares off against one of 6 defenses in the NFL that are allowing greater than 250 passing yards per contest. That's the Arizona Cardinals. I think that, along with Cooper Kupp's constant involvement in this offensive scheme in Los Angeles, makes up for the fact that the Rams should win this game easily. After a bit of a sluggish start, A.J. Brown is right back where he should be. He has at least 10 targets in 3 of the first 5 weeks, and he's the wide receiver 9 in a standard PPR format. We talked about Tyreek Hill being a big play target. Well, A.J. Brown is right up there with him. Brown is 3rd in deep ball targets and 12th in red zone targets. He leads all Eagles receivers in total targets by 17 as well. I have no problem admitting that I was wrong, very wrong, clearly, about Keenan Allen. At least that's how it's looked so far. I ranked him around fringe top 20 for the whole year in my preseason wide receiver rankings because of the age factor. I also got spooked by his nagging injury last year and just flat out doubted somebody who has time and time again been one of the most consistent producers at his position pretty much since he entered the NFL. He's the wide receiver 8 overall in fantasy at the moment, and he's been the go-to guy against man coverage this year. He has a ridiculous 38% target share in those situations. I mention this because Dallas, his opponent for this week, will revert to man coverage more often than any other team. Calvin Ridley is slowly looking like the main guy in Jacksonville, even though Christian Kirk technically has him covered in targets at the moment. Ridley's air yard share has been the highlight of his game as he posted a mark of 48.5% this last week. Both he and Zay Jones lead the team in receiving touchdowns with a pair of them. Indianapolis, his opposition, also allows the 5th most amount of passing yards per contest at 263, and Jacksonville is a 4-point favorite at home, but I would not disrespect Gardner Minshew and just go out there assuming the Jags will go with a run-heavy scheme late because they're ahead. Indianapolis could shock some people and make this a ball game. We need to watch the status of Davante Adams here, considering he was yet again a limited participant in practice Thursday with a shoulder injury. Adams has played through this injury over the course of the last 2 weeks, so barring any major setbacks the next 24-48 hours, I would say he's safe. He was in for a full workload of 94% of snaps last week against the Packers, but again, was only able to put up 4 receptions for 45 yards, a quiet day at the office. The Patriots, as opposition this week, are middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, but the main thing here is to keep an eye on whether Adams is feeling 100% or if he's going to trudge through another game and maybe not perform at his best. DJ Moore just had one of the most unique performances I've ever seen, and I will also give Justin Fields some credit for that as well. Moore was the only wide receiver to catch a ball last week for the Bears against Washington, and Fields has a perfect passer rating when throwing in the direction of number 2. The Vikings secondary has still struggled mightily. They're among the bottom third of the league in passing yards allowed, and they have also given up the third most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers so far. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Justin Fields probably throws to Moore a lot more after what we've seen in these last 2 weeks. Puka Nacua is not going anywhere, folks. I'm a firm believer of that. Even with Cooper Kupp back, Nacua saw his usual output of over 10 targets in a game. He now has back-to-back weeks with a touchdown, and the record holder for the most receiving yards through the first 5 games of one's career still seems to be a pretty sustainable fantasy option. He only has 2 red zone targets so far. That's third among Rams players. But as you have probably noticed by now, he doesn't need to get into the end zone to be effective. Nacua faces off against a combination of Marco Wilson and Kytrell Clark, and the Cardinals this week, they both have allowed a passer rating above 100. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been bruised up for the last couple of weeks now, but seeing he was a full participant by Thursday's practice was really promising news. The wide receiver 21 in fantasy PPR has seen at least 7 targets in each week that he's played so far. We've already seen a pair of 100-yard games from St. Brown, and it looks like Jared Goff is actually throwing to him on some deeper routes this year. The 75% catch percentage is a promising mark for somebody entering the 3rd season with his quarterbacks, establishing some more rapport, getting more confidence. Detroit does run the ball a lot relative to the rest of the league at 50%, mainly because of those touches that they are feeding David Montgomery, but they'll be facing one of their greater challenges this week in the Buccaneers. We'll see if they have to lean on the other dimension of their game in the pass, and in turn, their sure-handed wide receiver. Adam Thielen has been a surprise to many, but we did say at the beginning of the year that he could be on track for a 1,000-yard season considering his situation. As the lead receiver who caught Bryce Young's first completion in preseason and first touchdown as well, it was pretty apparent that he'd be the reliable option on this Panthers team. Now, this isn't an exciting offense by any means, but they're one of the worst football teams in the league and are consistently working from behind. Because of that, this team has gone very throw-heavy, allowing Thielen to have the volume he's seen so far. The Panthers have thrown the ball 65% of the time. That is the 4th highest rate in the league currently. Thielen will face the Dolphins this week, who give up the 11th most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers, but also, more importantly, the Panthers are 13.5-point underdogs. Expect another throw-heavy scheme from the Panthers and more volume for the wide receiver 10 in fantasy so far. Enough said on that front. Christian Kirk comes in not far behind his teammate in Calvin Ridley. Kirk is the number 1 target on this team by a slim margin, despite being listed as the wide receiver 2 on the Jags depth chart, but there are a pair of reasons I have him behind his teammate for this week. For one, Ridley has him beat by 4 yards per reception. He's getting much more down the field looks, which does present the opportunity of bigger plays and more points. Second off, while the Colts, their opposition, have allowed north of 260 passing yards, they've actually been locked down against slot receivers. They allow the 8th fewest amount of PPR points to slot receivers. Look for Jacksonville to work outside the numbers more, but Kirk should still get some targets considering he has been the more reliable option from a catch percentage perspective on this team. DK Metcalf hasn't seen a ton of usage so far. His season high in targets is just 8, and he has mainly had to rely on big chunk plays to produce. He's also listed as questionable at the time of this recording, so please keep that in mind and ask any questions you may have going forward. Metcalf is Geno Smith's favorite option against zone coverage. He has a team-best 25.5% first read share, meaning Smith is looking to him early and often. However, the Bengals have allowed the 5th least amount of PPR points per target to outside receivers, aka Mr. Metcalf. Keep an eye on this rib injury and monitor any type of snap count limit. If he has such a thing, you know the rules. Drop him down a tier and ask me any questions you've got. Michael Pittman Jr. is going to experience another quarterback change as it's back to the drawing board with Gardner Minshew, since Anthony Richardson could be out for up to 2 months. Considering that Michael Pittman Jr. has averaged around 900 yards per season with Carson Wentz, the worst version of Matt Ryan, and Phillip Rivers right before retirement, I think the current wide receiver 26 in fantasy will do just fine against a team that's bottom 3rd in fantasy points allowed to the position. Indianapolis is a 4-point underdog, but again, don't be shocked if this team leans a little more on the run. Minshew continues to shock people, and Jonathan Taylor coming back, being eased into his role, definitely plays a factor as well. Jalen Waddle has had a very underwhelming start to this season. He hasn't finished as higher than the wide receiver 20 in any week this season. I do have him doing that this week. And the Dolphins are projected to absolutely destroy the Panthers, which is not good for wide receivers like Waddle if they don't get involved early. He needs to score early and often. Otherwise, I could easily see this being a Raheem Mostert day where that guy gets plenty of touches on the ground and the game's blown out of proportion. Then again, this is also a Miami team that decided to put up 70 points on the Broncos not too long ago, clearly making a point. Bottom line, I'm having a tough time leaving the second receiver on the best offense in the league off of this list just yet. But if he does continue to underperform, I'll continue to drop him down and eventually out of these rankings. Jordan Addison hops all the way up to number 18 on this list. For starters, he's on the most pass-heavy team in the league in the Vikings. Minnesota throws the ball just over 70% of the time, and that makes sense considering their arsenal of talent out wide, combined with the fact that they've only won one game so far. Addison is the third favorite target on this team behind Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson, but obviously Jefferson is down for the next few weeks. Chicago's defense is also bruised up with Eddie Jackson and their number one corner in Jalen Johnson having their statuses up in the air. But speaking of bruised up, Jordan Addison is questionable following Thursday's practice. I would sneak KJ Osborne into the top 30 of rankings just because somebody has to get targets on this pass-heavy team. See, I would say we're about to learn a lot about Brandon Ayuk against a Cleveland defense allowing a league-low 125 passing yards per game, but now on top of that, it's supposed to rain. Keep this considered for the 49ers' number one target, but also understand that he's producing at an astronomical rate with an average of 4.3 yards per route run. Ayuk has racked in just south of 80% of his targets, and he has 40% of the team's receiving yards against man coverage. The Browns operate out of man coverage more often than 30 NFL teams, so all but one. Monitor this weather situation because if there's a torrential downpour out there in Cleveland, forget about it. Chris Olave was one of our buy low candidates for this week following two of the worst fantasy performances we've seen in his young career. We mentioned before that he was seen running with a bit of a hobble before his week 5 matchup against the Patriots, but that game also got ugly quick and left the Saints with no motivation to throw the ball when they're up 30 points. Olave was upgraded to a full participant in Thursday's practice following his toe injury that was reported throughout the week, and the upside is definitely there. He has a league-leading 15 deep ball targets so far, so we've got potential. It is a tough matchup this week against Houston, one where the total points line is at just 42.5, but Olave's big play potential in this offense is undeniable as the wide receiver one on this team. Mike Evans is another receiver battling an injury. He was questionable on Thursday after being upgraded to a limited participant in practice. He's the wide receiver 16 in standard PPR at the moment, and it's that dynamic, once again, where Evans is the down-the-field target while Godwin gets targets on the underneath routes. Evans is coming off of a down week against the Saints where he left early with an injury. He'll square off against the Detroit team that's allowing over 220 passing yards per contest, middle of the pack. Keep in mind, the Lions are favorites, and in my opinion, still a better team than the Bucs right now. If the Bucs were to go down, they will have to go throw heavy towards the end to try and play catch up. If Deebo Samuel was just a regular wide receiver, he probably isn't on this list considering the poor weather and difficult matchup in Cleveland that we mentioned before. But because of that rushing role he has, and because of how creative Shanahan can get, it'll be interesting to see if Samuel gets even more usage on the ground if this does turn into a game where it's just not smart at all to pass. San Fran already runs the ball a league-high 55% of the time, and considering that Deshaun Watson is now out, they've been elevated to 10-point favorites. If this team can get ahead by multiple possessions, that's another motivating factor to run the ball. And CMC is not getting it every time if this starts to be a chew-out-the-clock scenario. Marquise Brown has outperformed expectations in fantasy with the help of Joshua Dobbs. Dobbs has thrown the ball in his direction 10 times in 3 of the first 5 weeks. He does have a catch percentage just below 60%, which is not optimal at all. So that makes Brown mainly volume reliant. Not to mention he does lead the team with 3 receiving touchdowns, so we got the scoring aspect as well. Zach Ertz is the secondary target on this team, and beyond him, nobody has even half of the amount of targets that Brown has. So again, lots of volume reliancy here, which is good for a team that's losing a lot of games. The Rams allow the second least amount of PPR points per target to perimeter receivers, aka Brown. But again, this is a bad team that will likely need to revert back to the pass, and Brown has just been their guy. Devonta Smith makes this list as another buy low candidate. 1 reception for 6 yards last week is anything but what we wanted, trust me. But the 5 targets at least shows that Jalen Hurts wasn't keeping the ball from him due to tough coverage. DJ Reed may be questionable. Otherwise, the Jets secondary is pretty healthy this week. If the Eagles can utilize play action this week, Smith should be above this ranking I have him at, considering he does lead all Philly pass catchers in play action targets. His target share in that situation is just above 29%. The more the Jets defense bites on this run, which Philly is known for, the better for the sake of Smith's fantasy value. Garrett Wilson rounds us out and is somebody with sneaky upside in week 6. His opposition in the Eagles are allowing 2.2 passing touchdowns per game. That is one of the highest rates in the league. And Garrett Wilson has had plenty of opportunities so far, okay? He's third in the league in red zone targets with 9 of them. The Eagles are hefty favorites in this matchup, meaning that the Jets will likely need to go more throw heavy at the end, especially with so many receivers being banged up in these rankings. If some don't go or are on a snap count, this guy and Garrett Wilson can rise right up them. Fringe players I have for this week are Nico Collins, Zay Flowers, Chris Godwin, Amari Cooper, Gabe Davis, and DeAndre Hopkins. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I greatly appreciate it. Feel free to leave any questions in the comment section below that you may have. Like and subscribe if we're helping you out as we roll into week 6, and we will see you in the next video.